Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Cordelia Biddle, author of Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil.
Cordelia Frances Biddle, author of Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil, the infamous bank war. It's hard to not notice that the main character in your book and you share a same last name. Now, did you always know about Nicholas Biddle when you were growing up, or is this something you learned about later on in life?
No, I knew about Nicholas Biddle, but I was not terribly interested in banking, and I grew up with a father who was a novelist, and so that side of the family didn't really appeal to me, but I became fascinated by him later on when I started looking at the history and looking at the history of our nation, looking at how divisive that era was, and then I thought, well, let me find out about this man. Surely he had a different life beside being a financier, and in fact, he did. And I don't know if you are aware, I write novels as well as nonfiction. So when I'm creating a character, and I have a series set in Philadelphia in the 1840s, and so this is my natural place to be, is in the 1840s, I guess. Maybe I'm just a Luddite at heart. But I really started wondering about his place in history and what the historicity of the era, how that informed him. And so I went back in time. The Biddles came to America in 1681 and settled in New Jersey, Burlington, New Jersey, then eventually came to Philadelphia. Nicholas Biddle's father fought in the Revolutionary War. One uncle served on the early state legislature. Another uncle died as a result of a terrible naval battle during the Revolutionary War. That was also a Nicholas Biddle, and so I thought, here's this family who are really uniquely centered in terms of the history of the United States. And then I started looking at Nicholas, my Nicholas, the financier, and he was so different than the rest of his siblings, the rest of his uncles. He graduated from Princeton University. What became Princeton University was then called the College of New Jersey. At the age of 15, the youngest person to this day to do so. And I thought, he's entirely different than his family. They were all kind of men of action, and he lived a life of the mind. And I thought, who is he? If I'm writing any character, any historical character, whether of my own invention or as he is, a true character, a true person, I want to know what the motive is. Who are these people? What were they like as children? How did their families and the historicity of the era affect them? What choices did they make? What choices couldn't they make? And so that's what led me into looking at him. I didn't start the book thinking that I was going to do an expose on banking. I really wanted to know who he was. And then, of course, which led me to his kind of terrible battle with Andrew Jackson, and also led me to a really fascinating time in our nation's history, because we were so polarized politically. We were, I would say, as polarized as we are now. And I wondered how we came out of it. what happened? I mean, if you look at the newspapers, which I read in their original form at the Library Company of Philadelphia, it was villainous, both sides attacking each other. There was one political cartoon of Andrew Jackson being roasted on a spit, and Nicholas Biddle was a devil, and Andrew Jackson was impaling him with a sword. I mean, these are vile. So how did we end up in that position as a nation, and how did we come out of it? I think I've answered your question way too long.
Now, Nicholas Biddle is what relation to you?
Oh, gosh. I'm direct descendant, so great-great-great-great-grandfather, something on that. It's a great-great-great something, rather.
Well, it sounds from your book, you mentioned his brothers, and it sounds like each of his brothers are deserving of a book, too. I mean, one was captured by the Barbary pirates.
That's correct, and I think they are deserving. I mean, the Barbary War was an amazing event in our history as well, and what happened to those men after they were captured and their heroic rescue. I deal with all of that in my book because although it is the bank is a central part of Nicholas Biddle's life, who his family was changed who he was as well. And so he, in fact, in 1804, from 1804 to 1807, he journeyed to Europe to become the secretary to the minister to first France and then to Great Britain, who was James Monroe. And his brother had just been released or rescued from the Barbary pirates, and so here he is traveling through Europe with a heroic brother, and yet he is still living a life of the mind. And I have posited in my book that he had a reason for being in Europe from 1804 to 1807. If for those of you who know your absolutely Napoleonic history down cold, you will know that this was the time when Napoleon was rampaging through the whole of Europe and capturing. Europe was in arms. And Biddle traversed throughout all of these various areas and never wrote about it. And I discovered his journals, these European journals that had been believed lost. They had actually just been misfiled at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And I wept when I found them. But here he is going through, from France into Austria, never mentioned troop movement or towns that had been destroyed by war. Not once he talked about all the people that he'd met and the art and architecture and lovely dinner parties and his hosts and hostesses. Never discussed the war. And he could not have not seen it. So I began to wonder what his true purpose was in traveling. He had, as you would say now, a perfect cover. He spoke many languages. He looked Byronesque in his early portraits. And could he have just seemed like, in today's understanding, a young scholar out traversing the world and looking at lovely art? But because he never wrote about the wars until he actually reached Greece, it made me wonder whether he was a confidential agent, perhaps. He went immediately to meet with President Thomas Jefferson when he returned, and there again at Andalusia, which is Biddle's home estate and now has been preserved. And the archives there have all of Biddle's original correspondence with James Monroe. And in that correspondence, there is a cipher. So I just wonder whether Biddle was writing letters home in code.
He was a spy?
I think so. But I have no way of proving it. But of course, you can't prove that spies are spies, can you?
And he was present at Napoleon's coronation. He was,
and he was delighted to have been there. He felt that all the pomp appealed to him endlessly. He was very young.
You describe him as having some callow narcissism.
Yes.
Well, he grew up with privilege, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. And highly educated, and not a sense that the world could be against him, which I think was part of the problem with his battle with Andrew Jackson, because no one had ever said no to him. If you're a child prodigy, and you go off to college when you're a teenager, and the only difficulty you have is that your voice hasn't yet broken, and you're still speaking in a sort of pipsqueak voice, and the young ladies think you're silly. That's not a hardship.
He was the head of a debating society at Princeton at something like age 14?
Yes, the Cliosophic Society, which still exists. And he was nicknamed Grammaticus. And I'm not sure that was a compliment or whether it was poking fun at him.
What would he have been like to be around at that point in his life?
I can't tell. I think probably went back and forth from being insufferable to he was very curious about everything. So I think he might have been a bit of a nerd. But he might have been very pompous and full of himself at the same time. I mean, if you think about a 14-year-old prodigy now, are they fun to be around, or can they be a little bit of a know-it-all?
You write about how he arranged to have himself appointed to the New Jersey militia so he
Yes.
could wear a uniform?
Yes. Well, that's before he went to Europe, and he wanted to look, there's his brother who had been rescued by the Barbary pirates, and he didn't want to go to Europe and look like he just was a kid. So he had this quite outlandish officer's coat made, and I think one of his brother James's fellow officers admired the buttons, which young Nicholas was very proud of. He was there again. He was 19 and really had not been anywhere except from Princeton to Philadelphia.
And you mentioned James Monroe, the fifth president. He had quite a relationship with him.
Yes, he served as Monroe's secretary during this time from 1804 to 1807. He was first in France and then went to Great Britain, and Monroe became his mentor, and Monroe confided in him as well, which was very interesting. They struck up a very strong friendship, but he was always at pains to impress Monroe. So the letters, which are a fairly recent, the correspondence between Monroe and Biddle is a fairly recent gift to Andalusia. The letters had been sitting in a descendant's attic for years. No one even knew they existed. And when I began my research, I went to the Library of Congress, where all of Biddle's other letters, or most of them are, and read these letters. And I thought, oh, ho-hum, pursuant to that question, I agree. And then found these letters, which are the draft correspondence, and they are entirely different. Same date, and lines excised, And so you have an entirely different idea of what Biddle was doing, why he was writing to Monroe. This had to do much later on with the Missouri Compromise, with a treaty with Spain that Biddle helped broker because he was social friends with a man named Onís, who lived in Philadelphia and was head of a shadow Spanish legation. So this was the Onís-Adams Treaty, and he was part and parcel of all of that. And that, no one would know that if this draft correspondence hadn't come to light.
You also write about a scrapbook that Nicholas Biddle put together fairly late in life, and you're the first person to dig through it?
Yes, it was all wrapped up, and I said to the archivist at Andalusia, we got to know each other very well because I spent a great deal of time there, and she was incredibly helpful. Connie Houchins is her name. And I said, what's this? And she said, well, I'm not sure. And we opened it up. It was wrapped in archival paper. She had wrapped it up but didn't really examine it. It was a large-size volume, and we realized it was a scrapbook. And so I started turning the pages and understood that Biddle was putting it together during the last days of his life. And you could see by the way that he put the different pieces of preserved newspaper or letters or whatever the information he wanted to preserve in the scrapbook, he glued it on the page, but sometimes a little crookedly, so I could see that his hand might have been shaking. He was by then fairly frail in health. This is long after the bank issue. And then it came to the last page, and there's nothing there. And I knew he was working on it. And I just wept because I thought I saw his death right there. And yes, he's a great, great, great ancestor, but it was as if I was looking at somebody who was maybe my father, my grandfather. I had by then become so close to him doing my research, but personally I felt I knew him, and I felt I knew and understood his grief over the bank war and how he was ultimately treated. And to see that those pages just end and know that he never returned to the book was grievous to me.
He seemed to spend his life crossing paths with the major people in American history at the time, and one of them, you write that when he came back from Europe, he studied the law, and one of his first clients was Aaron Burr, after he had shot Alexander Hamilton.
Aaron Burr was a very good friend of Nicholas's father, Charles. And when Aaron Burr shot Hamilton, he fled and came to Philadelphia and stayed with Charles. Nicholas then was about to leave for France and was very upset that his father had taken in Burr. And felt that this was going to be a blot on the family. So he actually left to go to France early because of Burr being in the household. But then when he returned, his father was still very concerned about Burr, very concerned about his emotional well-being, and persuaded young Nicholas, as a young attorney, which, by the way, he didn't really cotton to take on Burr as a client. And he did so, and they both had attended Princeton, and he did so and really, I think, understood then what the situation was with Burr and why Burr felt so disenfranchised.
And when he was leaving France, he came back to Philadelphia, and I want to read something you write about Philadelphia at the time. Philadelphia could become a dirty, dangerous place where mad dogs roamed the streets, attacking children, adults, and other dogs, and causing deadly and excruciating hydrophobia, now known as rabies. So it's not an image you get of Philadelphia at the time with mad dogs storming the streets.
No, you don't. But then think about the fact that we really didn't know much about medicine, and think about the 1793 yellow fever epidemic, and subsequent epidemics of the same kind. And we didn't know anything about hydrophobia except that it existed. And if you think about refuse was thrown out into the street. So it looks very cleaned up now in some cases. Sometimes not so much, because we still have lots of trash problems. But then people didn't understand health as well as they do now, and so
Why did he come back to Philadelphia? It seemed like a lot of his attention was on the national government, and he didn't go to Washington.
Well, he actually when he returned, he first went to Washington to confer with then President Jefferson. So his parents expected him to arrive in Philadelphia, and they went to the lazaretto, the quarantine hospital in the Delaware River, to meet him, and he had decamped already and gone, decamped in Delaware and gone down to Washington. So, and they were very disappointed, but they also understood that he was serving his country in some way, which is why I think he might have been a confidential agent, because they wrote to him and said, duty to your country comes first. You will see your parents when you return.
And also, talking about things that seemed to just come his way, he edited the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I want to read the title. Book titles are more concise these days, but this was the Journal of the Expedition under the command of Captain Lewis and Clark to the sources of the Missouri, thence across the Rocky Mountains and down the river Columbia to the Pacific Ocean, performing during the years 1804, 5, 6 by order of the government of the United States. That's a catchy title.
Yes, and there again, I wonder whether Jefferson had something to do with Biddle's being appointed to that position. William Clark wrote to Biddle, he was part of the literary scene in Philadelphia at the time. He was a young attorney, but his real love was writing, and he was the then acting editor of the preeminent literary magazine, the Portfolio. And so he was probably a good choice, but it was also, I thought it was odd. And why? And was it because he had met with Jefferson, or what was that connection? Because obviously the whole expedition was all Jefferson's idea in the beginning. But William Clark wrote to Biddle and said, you have been recommended to me. Would you consider being the editor of these journals? And he felt absolutely ill-equipped and wrote back and said, I don't think I could possibly do that, and I have another career. And then, in typical fashion, because he was rash, which I love about him, he changed his mind, and changed his mind probably 2 days later, and immediately sent another letter to William Clark saying, yes, of course, I would love to take on this task. And then, lest that letter be delayed, he jumped on a stagecoach and headed down to Virginia to meet with Clark, so that he could plead his case, and kept a journal along the way in French. So I'm there again, did he imagine that other people were auditioning for the same role? And was he looking at them and saying, I'm going to beat you out? I don't know. But he met with Clark and he took on the task. And I spend some time in my book writing about that because I thought the letters between Clark and Biddle, of Clark reliving this extraordinary adventure, danger, and terror, and joy, and wonderment, and Biddle reliving it really like an armchair traveler, but trying to put all these notes into concise form and ask what this word meant, what that word meant, and also looking at the tribal languages and asking what those various words were in those languages. And so what was it's a curiosity.
Now, you write in your book that he served a couple years in the Pennsylvania legislature, but he never pursued a career as an elected official?
He did not. I think he found it to be really difficult. He started out working for the betterment of people who were impoverished and education. He was very interested in providing education for everyone, and he was working hard at all of those. I think those were the interests that were close to his mind. And then there came this argument about whether the first bank of the United States should retain its charter. And that was Alexander Hamilton's bank, obviously, and that was in 1810. And the anti-bank people, who were myriad, felt that there should be no central bank, that each state should have a bank, and Biddle felt absolutely not. He was 23, 24 at that time, and he felt that there had to be a central bank because otherwise really people couldn't be well cared for. If it's a state bank, then all of a sudden this whole states' rights issues was rearing its ugly head. And so that was his first argument in front of the chamber, and he spoke for upward of 3 hours with just a handful of notes. I saw his notes, and they're tiny little pieces of scraps of paper, but he was impassioned in his defense of a central bank, and brooked no argument at all. But he lost. And so Alexander Hamilton's first bank of the United States lost its charter in 1811. And I think it was such a blow for Nicholas that this vision of what kept the country going and made it successful and allowed people to borrow money and pay it back and move money from state to state, that it all of a sudden was destroyed. And then, of course, we have the War of 1812, and that which nearly bankrupted the nation because there was no money. It was just still states' banks then. So I think he was very disillusioned by politics and said, enough is enough. I'm not going to do that.
You say in here his brief history as a legislator failed to improve his image because he had focused on what his more seasoned colleagues viewed as useless causes.
Yes.
Now, he parted ways with some of his colleagues on the issue of slavery?
Yes, absolutely. Well, his father had been a sea captain early days, and one of the people that he worked for said, no, I want you not to just be a sea captain moving goods around. I want you to be the captain of a slaver and slaving ship. And he absolutely refused. He said, I think this trade is evil and reprehensible and should be stopped, and I won't have anything to do with it. And so early abolitionist and Nicholas Biddle grew up that way. I mean, they started out as Quakers, and yes, Quakers owned enslaved peoples, but he grew up thinking that was altogether vile. So yes.
Now, we're more than halfway through this discussion and we haven't yet gotten to the second Bank of the United States, which is kind of the focus of your book. But I have to ask about a couple of more things before we get into that. One is he befriended Joseph Bonaparte, speaking of Napoleon Bonaparte, Joseph Bonaparte moved to Philadelphia after Bonaparte fell?
Yes, and had built an enormous mansion in New Jersey, which ultimately burned down, but the grounds are still there, and they became very good friends. And so Biddle would journey from his estate on the Delaware across to Bonaparte's estate, and they also knew each other in Philadelphia because Bonaparte had a house in Philadelphia. But it was cosmopolitan city then, Philadelphia. It had been the capital, and so people from various nations lived here and were completely comfortable speaking in different languages. It was it was eventually eclipsed by other cities, but at the time it was the city.
He was also friends with Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper. He ran with a pretty fast company.
He did. And my research into his uncle's death in this terrible naval battle, a great deal of that research was in a book written by James Fenimore Cooper on the entire history of the United States Navy. And each battle, each ship, the tonnage of each ship, the various headings, it was all so beautifully detailed. And I had no idea until I said, I need to find out about this battle. And lo and behold, James Fenimore Cooper led me right into moment by moment, blow by blow.
Well, I guess we should start talking about the banks. And you mentioned the first Bank of the United States. First of all, can you talk about how it worked and why it was necessary and why did it go away in the first place?
Well, Hamilton's idea and ideal was that commerce drove the nation. And that was Biddle's ideal as well. And how then, if commerce drives the nation, and we are a nation that is joined up of various states and interests, then how does that commerce affect people from different cultures, backgrounds, and so forth? So if you're a northern state, or you're a Virginian, how does that commerce affect you? And so it was Hamilton's brilliant idea that there would be a central bank rather than just the Bank of Virginia or the Bank of New York or the Bank of Rhode Island, that everything would be consolidated, and so monies could move freely, and it would be a national money, stamped with a national character and a national, whether it was gold or it was ultimately paper, that it would have a national character.
But it was privately owned.
It was privately owned, but it was also chartered by the United States government. So how that ultimately worked in Hamilton's time, I'm not sure, but it came under the aegis of the government.
So did all the federal money stay in that bank?
Yes.
Like when you paid your taxes, it went to the Bank of the United States?
Yes.
Why did it go away?
Because the states' rights people felt that there should be, if money is in Pennsylvania, it should stay in Pennsylvania. It shouldn't go to help out the farmers in Virginia or the industrialists in Rhode Island. So that's why it went away.
Is there an equivalent of that bank today?
The federal bank. But the Fed didn't come into existence until 1930s, I think. 1930s, not 1830s. Mm-hmm. So we did not have a national bank. After Jackson destroyed the second Bank of the United States, there wasn't a central bank until the Fed.
Was it a political thing that killed the first bank, like people who didn't like Alexander Hamilton?
Yes, yes. And one of the people who was most against it, seems so bizarre, and I can't figure this out, but one of Andrew Jackson's confidants, not a member of his cabinet, but somebody who had his ear, was James Hamilton, who was Alexander Hamilton's son, and he hated the idea of a central bank.
So if they killed the first Bank of the United States, how did the second one come about?
Because actually it happened in 1816, yes, 1816, because of the War of 1812. And everybody realized we are almost dying as a nation because we don't have a national bank. So that's when the second Bank of the United States was chartered.
How much of the financing and the inner workings of the second bank did you have to understand to write this book? Because it's kind of complicated. It's
complicated, and I avoided spending a lot of time on it because that is not my métier. I really was far more interested in the personalities and why. I will leave that to somebody who really understands. And there, Bray? There are writers who have really delved into the inner workings of the first bank and the second bank. And I read them and said, that's fascinating, but I want to know who were these characters who were either for the bank or against it, and why.
So when the second bank came along, your ancestor, Nicholas Biddle, was named a director. So what did he know about finance, and how did he learn it?
That's another curious question, because it was Monroe who named him as a director. And the bank was in disarray then. It was chartered, all was going well, except there was some illicit dealings, and there were bank members who were on the board, who were in control, who were filling their own pockets. Monroe was deeply concerned about this, and so he asked Nicholas Biddle, and I think there again, Nicholas Biddle was acting as a Monroe spy to tell him what was going on. So and then Monroe was able to expunge some of those directors who were pilfering.
I want to read this. You're right. Baltimore was the home of the second bank's most egregious transgressors, 3 men whom Monroe in private noted to Biddle called them dark and insidious villains. So they were raking off basically federal funds.
That's right.
Second bank got off to a bad start.
It did. It started out maybe for a few months and it was fine. And then of course, these people came in and said, oh, free money, I'll just take it. And so that's when Biddle came into his first role. So he was in constant contact with Monroe as what was going on.
And so they couldn't shut down the bank at that point? I mean, it had a charter for a certain amount of time?
They did, and I think, I mean, there again, Monroe completely believed in the bank, and it was just get rid of these villains, and then bring in people who were honest.
So Nicholas Biddle eventually became president of the bank?
Yes, yep, 1823.
What did he do to turn it around?
He brought in people that he felt he could trust. He created checks and balances. He was very scrupulous. He was, which it's interesting given his kind of rash personality, that he also understood how to run a business. And so he created a whole, I mean, he wrote 3 volumes on how the bank should work and how the various directors of the various branches should interact with each other and how reports should be made and how those reports should be read. And so there were constant checks and balances.
Was the bank profitable?
Well, I don't know. I don't think I ever asked myself that question.
Because it had shareholders, and you'd think
Yes.
the shareholders would want...
Yes, I would assume it was. He was very much admired by his European counterparts in France and England. The Barings and the Rothschilds thought he was doing an admirable job. So I didn't even ask that question. Now, thank you for... Maybe that's because I'm an author and I don't ask about profits.
Why was the bank in Philadelphia? I mean, Wall Street was emerging at the time, and Washington was the capital. Why put the bank in Philadelphia?
Well, but Philadelphia had been the capital, and that's where the first bank was centered. And I think it was not until really Van Buren was Jackson's vice president and a New Yorker, and that's when basically Wall Street started to move, because Philadelphia was the original, not Wall Street, but it was the banking center.
Yeah, you say that Martin Van Buren, his motive of encouraging Jackson's battle with Biddle was less the central bank's death than its removal from Philadelphia to the place he believed it should be its natural home, New York, which was his home.
That's right. So then that was the birth of Wall Street. And he said this is, if you think about the envy between cities and states, Washington was chosen as the capital because it was nowhere land. It was a marshy mess of a place that had to be created out of whole cloth. But because the Northerners didn't want Virginia, Richmond to be the capital, and the Virginians didn't want, let's say, Massachusetts, Boston to be the capital. So there was this sense of perhaps pride and envy, and Van Buren, being a New Yorker, felt, no, it has to be New York.
Is the second bank building still standing?
Oh, yes. And it is wonderful. It's now a portrait gallery, and there's quite a wonderful portrait of Nicholas Biddle and of Jane, his wife, in it, but also all of the leading members of the eras. And it's the building is absolutely extant. It has been beautifully restored. I just go and hang out there and lurk around and think of Nicholas Biddle standing there and striding out. He created the building to look like a Greek temple because he was so admired the architecture of ancient Greece. And we didn't know anything about Greek revival until all of a sudden it was here in the form of a bank. So temple to finance.
Now, another one of the major characters in history who Nicholas Biddle dealt with was John Quincy Adams, the sixth president. So he was very much an ally with John Quincy Adams. And did that fact put him on the outs with Andrew Jackson?
Oh, probably yes, because Jackson hated Adams. I mean, they had a bitter battle over who was going to be president, and Jackson's supporters attacked the supporters of Adams. People were beaten up going to the polling place. But I think also Jackson mistrusted banks because he had been bankrupted, and I think there was this sense there again of he represented voters who had long felt disenfranchised, who viewed the moneyed aristocracy as the moneyed aristocracy who wouldn't let them participate in the running of government. And so Jackson's adherents were this new group of voters who decided they were going to oust the people who had been in charge for decades.
He also felt that the election of 1824 was rigged and he was robbed of the election.
Yes. And that may have been true, but remember, Thomas Jefferson was very much opposed to Jackson. He felt he was a dangerous man. He felt that he couldn't control his emotions, that his temper ran away with him, that he didn't find people that he could trust or that the people that he trusted were untrustworthy, and he had worked with him in the Senate. So was he robbed of it, or were there other forces at work? I don't know. It's really hard to pull all of that apart.
You also say preparations for the election of 1828 had begun almost immediately following the election of 1824, when Jackson and his supporters swore they would never be cheated out of the presidency again. So the stage was set for when Jackson got elected for him to take on the bank?
Absolutely. And Biddle hoped that Jackson would change his mind. He knew that he was mistrusted banking as a whole. He was a rough-hewn ex-soldier. And so the running of a government or a large financial institution was not in his history. But Biddle really hoped that he could persuade Jackson, once Jackson became president, that this was for the good of the nation. However, Jackson's supporters and his cabinet were of one mind, which was just expunge all the people who have kept us in our place rather than letting us rule the nation.
And Nicholas Biddle was just the type of well-born kind of elitist who Andrew Jackson just didn't like.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to imagine what would have happened if they'd actually passed each other on the streets of Philadelphia. And they may well have at one point or another before Jackson became president, when he was in the Senate. Who knows? But they were polar opposites. And Jackson was very proud of his heritage. He was very proud of being, as I said, rough-hewn, lacking an education. Nicholas Biddle had this kind of, as I said, a child prodigy with this extraordinary education. He was a polymath. They were complete polar opposites. One was highly cultured. One was proud of not being cultured. One came from what was then sort of the as it was called, the Athens of America. All the center of the arts and sciences, and one from pioneer stock.
I want to ask you about, there's a little sidebar in your story that I'd like you to talk about, is the Peggy Eaton scandal.
Oh, yes, the petticoat affair. Peggy Eaton was a fascinating character. She was wife to one of Jackson's members of his cabinet, but she had been married before, and then there was a scandal about which would have been all right, but there was a scandal about whether she in fact had begun an affair with Eaton before she married him. And so all of the wives of the other cabinet members and the wives of the various senators didn't want anything to do with her. And they refused to meet with her. They refused to socialize with her. They refused to even admit her into their realm. And so Jackson had to decide whether to support Eaton in this disaster or not. And he was a stubborn man, just as Nicholas Biddle was, and he decided to support Eaton, even though this almost blew his cabinet up.
How did it end up?
It ended up being pushed under the carpet, just the way most scandals do.
Now, Nicholas Biddle was married?
Yes, he was married. His wife, Jane, loved music. She was a homebody. It was a real love match, but I think pretty much arranged by Jane's mother.
Who you say is a force of nature.
She was an absolute force of nature. She was Irish. There again, spoke several languages, came to this country, had married a man who owned ships. So, and so she came here and and had this is the original state, Andalusia on the Delaware, and I think saw young Nicholas as a rising star and arranged for an introduction with her daughter, who I think was very much in awe of her mother, and kept in the shade a bit of her mother because she really couldn't compete. Peggy was very grand. She was petite, but very grand in demeanor. She was a flirt. She loved to entertain. And Jane was really a complete opposite of her mother, and really a homebody, as I said, and she loved raising her children, being with her children. When Nicholas then really became more and more in the public eye, that made her unhappy. She was so much happier up at Andalusia, their country estate, than she was in their house in Philadelphia. Biddle loved to entertain, and he entertained continuously, maybe every night of the week. And Jane was much happier just with hearth and home.
So Andalusia was his wife's family home?
Yes.
Is it open to the public today?
It is. It is. You have to make a reservation because with COVID, it shut down, but now it's being opened again. You can stroll the grounds, and then they're open certain days of the week that you can walk through the house, and you can see Nicholas Biddle's library. And I spent so much time in his library, and to me, he's alive in all of his books. Those are his books. He collected them throughout his life. He collected them in Europe in 1804 to 1807. And so, all of the volumes are there. So it's original Latin, ancient Greek. He's read them all.
Now, when Andrew Jackson decided he wanted to kill the second bank, did he really understand what was going on? Did he get the role of the bank, or did he just want to stick it to the elites?
I think that was it. I think the latter. I don't think he really understood banking as well as he should have. And remember, he had James Hamilton and Van Buren telling him this would work. And each had their own rationale for why it would work. Maybe Van Buren simply wanted to have a private bank that would be centered in New York. I don't know it, but I think he was being manipulated by people who told him they understood the situation, and he just said, I hate these people.
Did the public follow this? I mean, was this something that was in the news?
It was in the news continuously, as any situation is, and I love doing historical research. I love delving into the different eras. I can spend hours reading one newspaper. And at the library company, they have all the original newspapers, and they bring them out in wonderful, vast volumes, and you page through them. And so each newspaper had their own take on it. So, for instance, Polson's, which was published in Philadelphia newspaper, and Niles Register, which was published in Baltimore, were pro-bank. So endless amounts of ink on why the bank. And then there were newspapers that were anti-bank and felt that there should be national banks and felt that there should be states' rights. So entirely different take. And so you as a consumer could read whichever news you wanted with the slant that appealed to you, just as we do now.
So if Jackson wanted to kill the bank, how would he go about doing it? I mean, it had a charter that ran a certain number of years?
That's right. And he refused to recharter it. And the whole Senate erupted over that. The Senate then vetoed his veto, and it became a real battle with loaded pistols being brought into the Senate chamber by Thomas Hart Benton, who was a Jackson supporter. And he said, not just, shouting match. Fortunately, the pistols were not unloaded. Did not explode, but it became a battle royale in the Senate.
You quote some of Andrew Jackson's veto message when the Congress passed a renewal of the charter. He says, allegations ranging from opulent citizens controlling the institutions to the bank being a monopoly of the foreign and domestic exchange that made the American people debtors to aliens. Anything accurate in that, or is it all hyperbole?
No, but I think there again, and I go into this other issue, which is too long to discuss, but there was something called the Poyer scandal, which happened in England, and it was money laundering in the extreme, and Jackson knew all about that and may have lost some money in that scandal. So he was very concerned about foreign interests, and of course we had foreign investors. Why wouldn't we, if we're this successful nation, just as we do now? But Jackson was, and the Poyer scandal is well worth discovering. It's a story that almost deserves its own film.
When did Nicholas Biddle know that he was beat?
37 was when the bank ended, and thereafter he tried to revive it. He tried to revive it through the Pennsylvania legislature. It revived for a while as being chartered in Pennsylvania, but ultimately that didn't work because it wasn't a national bank. And he had been so pilloried in the press. And Jackson was pilloried as well. Jackson retreated to the Hermitage, and Biddle eventually retreated to Andalusia and died, I think, really of a broken heart.
As you were writing this book and doing the research, did you ever imagine yourself having a conversation with Nicholas Biddle, and what would you talk about?
Oh, that would be so wonderful. I would like to start out with his scrapbook. I would like to ask him what he felt proudest of, what he felt most anxious about, whether he felt that he had been, whether hubris had taken him down the wrong path, whether he could have been more measured, what he loved in life, what he feared. I would just like to get to know him as a person. As I said, it's always in any story, and one of the courses I teach at Drexel is in examining history through a creative lens. So looking at a historical figure and wondering who they were, not simply the era and not simply putting a lot of facts and figures up there, but who that person was. And I would love to know what his hopes and dreams had been, what he'd been like as a child. As I said, I sometimes I think I'm actually having that conversation with him, certainly in his library in Andalusia. And I was just up there a few weeks ago and got to sit in that library and look out at the Delaware River and imagine that he was there with me.
We have been speaking with Cordelia Frances Biddle. She is the author of this book, Biddle, Jackson, and a Nation in Turmoil, The Infamous Bank War. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.